And so I suggested to him that he see a series of movie screens or crystal balls in which he would see stills, still life pictures of tremendous importance. I had Harvey forget his name, his identity, his age, the fact that Harvey as a person really existed. All he was an intelligence that was looking at all of those things that I had scattered around the room for him to look at. He saw the little boy on his way to school as a moving picture. Most of them were moving pictures. He followed the little boy to school. He saw the little boy getting his hands wrapped by the school teacher. He saw the school teacher forcing that little boy to change from the left hand to the right hand in writing. He saw the little boy getting punished rather brutally by the teacher. One particular day, he saw that boy walking home very sadly. And Harvey looked and he commented on the pitifulness of the scene. He saw that little boy walking home and reaching home and looking into the yard over the gate. And there he saw the sheriff's deputy with a gun in his hand. The deputy had just finished shooting the little boy's dog. And then he saw the little boy crying. And then I told him to start there and see another picture several years later where that same emotion would come forth. And he saw that same boy at the age of 10 out in the woods hunting with his brother and feeling terrible about killing a rabbit. And then he saw the boy at about the age of 15 lying on the top of a ruined dam and thinking about all the dreadful things that can happen to human beings. And then he saw a 22-year-old or thereabouts young man who had just been turned down by a girl who felt very wretched and very inferior. And then he saw that same young man in the same emotional state of depression who was walking out of a courthouse. He'd just been divorced, and he felt rather suicidal and tremendously inferior. And then he saw the young man at the age of 28 getting discharged from a job he liked. And then he saw the young man at 30 feeling horribly wretched. And I asked Harvey, the intellect, to review all of those pictures and what they probably meant. And Harvey reviewed them and analyzed them for me. And he spoke about the thread of continuity and the repetition of traumatic experiences that goes through life. But Harvey didn't know he was talking about himself, and Harvey didn't know that he was seeing himself. And I could ask him to speculate upon what would happen to that young man. And his statement was that the young man, if anything more like that happened to him, would undoubtedly try to commit suicide, always on the losing end, since he had lost out in everything throughout life, and that he'd try to commit suicide on the losing end. But the losing end meant what? This is a beautiful day in March, and he wrote that, looked at it, and jumped to his feet and said, I can write clearly. I can write legibly. And he went around and around that group of doctors and demanded that everyone praise his writing. He was literally a jubilant little boy. And he was utterly embarrassing to the audience because of his jubilance until they recognized the tremendous force of that. Now, Harvey's job was a fifth-rate job where his boss kicked him around. Harvey did this writing, and during the rest of the evening he bragged and bragged about his excellent handwriting. And I suggested that he would keep that sense of accomplishment, that sense of personal pride with him, and that he would use it in every essential way. The next day when Harvey went to work, he talked back to his boss for the first time, and he demanded an increase in payment in his salary, and got it. Then he demanded a better desk. Harvey drove a car to work. He always parked it in a particular place in the parking lot. And there was one other employee there who always boxed him in with his car. And that employee worked a half an hour longer than Harvey. And Harvey would sit and fume helplessly in a Casper milk toast fashion in his car, waiting for the other guy to come and move his car. Well, that night, Harvey went out and told the chap, "Listen, you big lug, I possibly could pick a fight with you for parking your car in that nasty fashion. You've done it for a long time, and I've taken it. We could have a fight about it, but I'd rather invite you in for a glass of beer, so let's go in and get a glass of beer and talk it over." That was the last time that guy ever parked his car to box in Harvey's car. Well, Harvey repainted his car because he felt a joy of possession in it. He got new slip covers. He changed his restaurant for a better restaurant. He changed his rooming house for a better rooming house. That surge of joy over that simple matter of writing his name legibly, and then writing the simple sentence, "This is a beautiful day in March," and giving him the permission to feel that tremendous boyish surge of jubilant joy was enough to carry him along. Now, I think it would have been an error for me to tell him to go down and demand better pay. I think it's been an error for me to tell him to tell off that guy who parked the car in the wrong fashion. Because he didn't need a direction about what to do, but he did need motivation. And that is one of the things in psychotherapy, in the use of hypnosis, the motivation of a patient to do things. Not the things that you necessarily think they ought to do, but the things that they as personalities have the feeling that they really ought to do. And one usually starts with rather simple things, because human beings are essentially, fundamentally, rather simple creatures. And therefore you ought to start that way and let them elaborate in accord with their own personality needs, not in accord with your concepts of what is useful to them. You only interfere when they try to destroy themselves. Now, much of hypnotic psychotherapy can be accomplished indirectly, as I did with Harvey, and by the use of post-hypnotic suggestion. A mere suggestion to a patient that you go home today and let your unconscious mind think over all the things that have been said, all the things that have been thought, and think of the patient who was making a psychoneurotic of herself by going out into the sunlight and developing a very, very severe rash of her arms, neck, face, a very, very severe rash. and then clawing it all night long till her arms and her face and her neck were horrible sights to look upon. She came to me because she said every dermatologist said it was just pure cussedness on her part, and every other doctor had said so. And she stated very definitely that she expected me to tell her that it was pure cussedness on her part. And I told her it wasn't necessary for me to tell her it was pure cussedness. She had already told me that, and I would take her word for it, but I still was entitled to believe my own thoughts about it. Thus, I accepted what she said, but at the same time, I gave tremendous reservations. I still was entitled to believe my own thoughts, and she could believe hers. And my suggestion to her was rather simple, namely, that she ought to enjoy as much of the sunlight as she wished, and that she really ought to enjoy the sunlight as much as she wanted to. I told her to go home. She was a subject, went into a medium trance. I told her to go home and lie down for an hour or two and let her unconscious think over what that meant. Well, she stated she didn't need to, that she consciously remembered what I had said, that she should go home and think over my suggestion that she should enjoy the sunlight as much as she really wished to, as much as she really wanted to. Her reaction was, after she got home and had proceeded to sit down and rest for an hour, was to get up and decide to go out in the garden. And she found herself motivated in putting on a very wide brim hat and long sleeves. And she found it very enjoyable out in the yard, and she worked in her flower garden. In the past, she'd been told to avoid the sunlight, to keep out of it, which was sensible, that she'd been told to shade herself and protect herself from the sunlight. I told her to enjoy it. And what does enjoyment of the sunlight mean? Putting yourself in a situation where you can really enjoy it, not fight against it, not protect yourself, but really to enjoy it. And she did like her flowers, and they were out in the sun, and therefore she willingly enjoying the sunlight. And that was all I actually did for her. But you see the implications of that suggestion. I didn't tell her to avoid the sunlight. I didn't tell her to protect herself. I told her to enjoy it. And her enjoyment of the sunlight would include enjoying herself post-sunlight, enjoy herself during her sleep, enjoy herself the next day. And all I needed to do was give her the motivation to enjoy the sunlight. And then she didn't have anything to fight against, because she was a rather hostile, antagonistic person. Her rash cleared up very promptly, and she came and protested that I charged too high a fee. And I told her, yes, my fee was high, but her enjoyment was much higher, and why not pay me my fee for the little that I had done? She sent me a total of some 10 other patients, even though she protested my high fee. And so I accepted her protests, but I accepted them on the grounds that were agreeable to her. In other words, you try to accept the patients. It is, no matter what they are, and then try to direct them. Now, this effort ever to force your patients to do things when you regress a patient and put them back to their childhood. Psychiatric patients, I like to do that, but I usually try to regress them to something pleasant, something agreeable. And I admit that we are wasting time because they're not there to have the pleasant things corrected. They're there to have the unpleasant things corrected. But in the trance state, I impress upon them that it's tremendously important that they realize that there are some good things in their past. And those good things in the past form the background by which to judge the severity of their present. And so I use the good things of their past, the happy memories, in order to train them to recover fully and completely the various traumatic experiences. And then I have them recover the traumatic experiences very completely, repress them, have them recover them again, repress them for the patient. You see, the patient comes to you with forgotten memories. They're repressed. Once you get a hold of them and relate them to the patient or have the patient remember them, the patient can use again his repressive powers and again forget those things. But if you yourself repress or create an amnesia for those things, the patient unwittingly is turning over to you the control of those traumatic experiences. And by turning over that control to you, that means that you are at liberty to reproduce the thing or to cover it up again, to bring it forth again, to cover it up again, until your patient builds up enough strength to face any particular issue. And you'll recognize the use of hypnosis in that, the ease with which you can elicit material, cover it up again. You're the one then that's doing it, and the repressions of the patient do not take over and control the situation. Now, concerning the various specific hypnotic phenomena, the matter of suggestibility. What type of suggestions and how does one give suggestions? The entirely negative, hostile patient who comes into your office, how are you going to deal with that patient? Experimentally, I've done it, and clinically, I've done it. The patient can come into my office absolutely resolved to try my patience and not to go into a trance. But the patient comes in intending to be totally contrary. Now, there are various ways of meeting that sort of resistance. I think of the doctor who came in for therapy. He'd called me long distance and written me letters, and listening to him over a long distance and reading his letters, I knew I had an exceedingly antagonistic man on my hands. And when he walked into my office, his shoulders were thrown back, his jaw jutted out, he sat himself down upright in the chair and said, "Now go ahead, doctor, and hypnotize me." I told him I thought he had many too many resistances. And he said he didn't care about his resistances. My job was to hypnotize him, not to make excuses. Would I please get going? I told him I would, and I proceeded to suggest that he go into a trance. The man had some knowledge of hypnosis, so I used a straightforward, domineering technique, knowing that it would be a total failure, and I worked on him for about an hour. using the best domineering technique while he smiled at me and resisted very effectively. And I finally built up his resistance in every possible way that I could. Then abruptly I said, "Excuse me a moment." I had prepared for this, having heard him over the phone, having read his letters. I stepped out into the other room, came back with a young college girl, a psychology student, a hypnotic subject of mine. Brought her into the room, said, "Ilsa, I would like to have you meet Dr. So-and-so. Dr. So-and-so came here to be hypnotized. Ilsa, will you please go into a deep trance right now?" So Ilsa went into a deep trance. I demonstrated a few of the hypnotic phenomena on her. I told her, "Sit down," and put the doctor into a trance and to call me just as soon as she had him in a trance. With that, I turned and walked out of the room. 15 minutes later, Ilsa came to the door and called me back into the office. Now, actually, what had I done? The doctor had his resistances, and plenty of them, so I centered them all on me. And when I walked out of the office, I carried that whole load. And furthermore, how can you resist somebody who's in a trance, who is merely responding to hypnotic suggestions? And Ilsa really used good hypnotic technique and induced a very satisfactory trance. Very often I use that technique in training people to go into a trance, especially resistant subjects or patients. And because it's one thing to resist me, but how can you really resist somebody who's in a trance, whose one and only purpose is to put you in a trance, not to make any other kind of allowance for you? It's very, very difficult to do that. I've got 2 doctors in Phoenix. You can work on them all night long and they won't go into a trance. They're both excellent hypnotists. And they were both very critical of me because I couldn't put them into a trance. So one night I had them sit down facing each other, and I told them, "Doctor, you hypnotize doctor, and doctor, you hypnotize doctor." And in that sort of a situation, they looked at each other, and then I added, "And while you're hypnotizing the other, go into a trance yourself and really demonstrate to the other how deeply into a trance you want the other to go." They both went very neatly, very deeply into a hypnotic trance. But of course they went in at my suggestion. And I stepped over after they'd put each other into a deep trance and took charge of the situation for both of them. That is one technique that I think all of you ought to recognize and try out sometime, because it'll teach you a great deal about establishing rapport. Neither one of those doctors realized that my instructions would result in their being in rapport with me after they had put each other in a deep trance. I quite often have my patients put into a deep trance by someone else, especially those patients that are utterly resistant and won't let the doctor do it. I usually try to get them to be as resistant toward me as can be so that I can gather up all the resistances and leave no resistance for the person who's going to put them in the trance. Now, another technique that I employ on utterly resistant subjects. One doctor came a couple thousand miles for the sole purpose of having me put him in a trance. He walked into my office, laid a check on my desk, and said, "That's to compensate you for your time." I heard that word, time. That check was to compensate me for my time. And he came there to be put into a trance. Obviously, the check was not to compensate me for putting him in a trance, but just to compensate me for my time. So I knew right then and there what he was going to do. He did one of the most beautiful jobs of resisting me that I ever saw, but consciously he thought he was cooperating. I spent 2 hours on the man, using every technique that I knew of seducing him into hypnosis, but failed absolutely. And finally I said, "Well, doctor, you've paid me for my time, and that's about all I've been able to give you. I'm awfully sorry I failed. But before you leave, I'd like to take you out in the other room and introduce you to my wife. She would like to meet you." So we went out in the next room, and I called my wife and stated, "Dr. So-and-so is on his way home. He's got to leave immediately, but he thought he would like to meet you." And then I said, "I'd like to shake hands before you leave, doctor." And he very graciously put out his hand, and I lifted it slowly, induced a deep hypnotic trance, led him back into the office, and did the work that he wanted me to do. Because you do not hypnotize a man after you say goodbye to him. He had no defenses, no guard, no way of protecting himself. And when I reached out to shake hands goodbye and slowly, gently, suggestively lifted his arm and induced catalepsy, I'd given him all the other suggestions about going into a deep trance previously. They all took effect. So I took him back in the office and spent a couple of hours more with him, correcting some difficulties that had prevented him from using hypnosis for over 15 years. He started out in his practice using hypnosis, ran into a traumatic personal experience, and thereafter could not induce hypnosis, was terribly afraid of it, awfully frightened by it. But after I induced that trance unexpectedly on him, then he returned to his practice and began using hypnosis extensively. In other words, one of the things that I've mentioned to you is this matter of surprise technique. One always tries to use whatever a patient brings into the office. If they bring resistance in, be grateful for that resistance. Heap it up in whatever fashion they want you to. Really pile it up. But never get disgusted with the amount of resistance. That doctor certainly had plenty of resistance unconsciously, when for 2 hours I did everything I could to put him in a trance. And then when I took him out in the other room to introduce him to Mrs. Erickson, his resistances had been piled up and left in the office. One really ought to recognize that. Now, this may seem as if I'm using anthropomorphic thinking, but it's an easy way of conceptualizing these matters. Whatever the patient presents to you in the office, you really ought to use. If they prevent you from hypnotizing them by crying or by giggling or by shifting around in the chair or doing any number of things. Why not utilize it?